I live on an abandoned parking lot, hidden between high rises. My name is Amy, and my home is an old, rusty car that no one touches. The nights here are long and dark, and often I feel like the wind whispers its secrets to me. One night, when the moon shone particularly bright, I sensed someone watching me. In the dim light, I spotted a silhouette at the edge of the parking lot. It slowly approached, and my heart raced in my chest. I tried to hide deeper in the car, but the stranger got too close. His face was pale, and his eyes were hollow, dripping with black liquid. Panic seized me, and I bolted from the car, running between the rows of vehicles. I could hear his footsteps following me, silent, yet relentless. Suddenly, I ran into an old concrete wall and realized I had nowhere left to go. Turning around, I saw the stranger had stopped. He extended his hand, and a horrible smell of decay and rot wafted from him. I tried to scream, but the sound stuck in my throat. Then I noticed an old photograph in his hand, the one where I was with my family, back when I was still happy. "You can't run away from your past," he whispered. At that moment, I understood that this strange man was a reflection of my own fears and regrets. My life, filled with loneliness and fear, had taken the form of this creature. Gathering my courage, I stepped toward him and embraced him. "I'm not afraid of you," I said. And in that instant, he dissolved into darkness. With him, all my fears vanished. Returning to my old car, I realized that now the wind, whistling through the rows of cars, whispered not about fears, but about hope. I no longer felt alone. Yes, life on the parking lot didn't get any easier, but I knew my fears could no longer confine me. Story number 2. On the outskirts of a large city lived a homeless man named Jack. He stood out from other homeless people not only because of his neat haircut and clean clothes, but also because of his behavior. Jack was always polite and smiled at passersby, despite often enduring hunger and cold. In the past, he had been an English teacher, but life changed drastically when his wife Lily went missing. Jack couldn't cope with the grief, and soon his world fell apart. He lost his job and friends. Wandering the streets, he tried to find any clues about Lily, but all his efforts were in vain. One night, as Jack sought shelter from the rain, he stumbled upon an abandoned building. Inside, he discovered an old library, filled with dust and cobwebs. The shelves were lined with books, many of which were covered in strange symbols and writings. One book caught his eye, a diary that described horrifying rituals and dark secrets. Jack began to read the diary, and with each page he felt more and more exhilarated. He learned how to summon a spirit to ask questions. Driven by hope, he decided to give it a try. That night, he gathered all the necessary items described in the book and performed the ritual. So when the candles extinguished and the air grew cold, a ghost appeared before him. It was Lily. Her face was twisted with horror and pain, and Jack realized he had summoned not just the spirit of his wife, but something far more sinister. She warned him, "Don't defile this world, Jack. I am lost, and now you are too. Leave while you still can." But Jack didn't listen. He continued to ask questions, and each time he spoke her name, whispers filled the air around him. Suddenly, the walls began to crack, and he felt something dark and cold wrap around his body. Lily's spirit vanished, leaving him alone with the growing darkness. From that moment on, Jack no longer smiled. He wandered the streets, his gaze vacant, and words stuck in his throat. They said he had become one of those who went missing. People also claimed that he could be found near the old library, whispering Lily's name, but no one dared approach him. For in the darkness, it was rumored that a shadow lurked, hunting those who dared to disturb the peace of the dead. Story number 3. When I was just starting my life as a college student in Tucson, Arizona, the world felt full of possibilities and adventures. I was a 17-year-old freshman who had just moved from the East Coast. My dorm room was located near 4th Avenue and Main Gate Square, a place bustling with life, but, unfortunately, not without its dark corners. On one of those early mornings, when I woke up before dawn, I decided to take a walk around the area. I always loved the early hours when the city was just waking up, but that day I was about to encounter the unexpected. I hadn't paid much attention to warnings about the potential dangers in the neighborhood, and as I stepped outside, I wasn't thinking of the consequences. As the sun began to rise, I was walking along 4th Avenue when I heard a voice. Behind a wall, a homeless man called out, claiming that someone had stolen his suitcase. In that moment, I felt my naivety clouding my judgment. Instead of walking away, I approached him. "You're beautiful," he said, grabbing my hand and kissing it. Inside, everything froze. I felt a rush of fear and pulled away, saying I need to go, but he wasn't ready to let me go. The man pulled a glass ball from behind him and stepped closer. "I'll walk you home," he said. Despite my instinct to flee, I preferred to walk with him rather than be left alone with his unsettling behavior. Every step felt like an eternity. I walked quickly, trying to hide my fear while he continued talking about his life, how he used to be happy, and how he missed having company. I realized I had to distract him and find a way out of this situation. In the distance, I spotted a group of people standing outside a coffee shop. Suddenly, I had a plan. "Look, my friends are over there," I exclaimed, pointing dramatically. For a moment, his attention shifted. Seizing the opportunity, I quickened my pace and headed toward the group, not looking back. As I reached them, I turned to see him still standing there, looking slightly confused and angry. I blended in with the crowd, explaining what had happened. The people were incredibly kind and offered to walk me back to my dorm. That morning became a lesson for me. I would never forget the naivety with which I had wandered those unfamiliar streets. From that day on, I became much more cautious and always remembered that even in bright daylight, shadows can linger. Story number 4. In a small town called Los Atlas, I grew up without thinking about the consequences of my actions. By the age of 17, I was a real troublemaker, shoplifting, stealing bikes, and constantly making headlines in the police reports. This wasn't just typical teenage rebellion. I was a constant source of worry for my parents. After one fight where I threw a bottle at my dad, he kicked me out of the house. I knew I had messed up, but pride wouldn't let me go back. Summer was hot, and I thought I could spend a few nights with friends. But soon my friends got tired of my antics and asked me to leave. I found myself on the streets, and once again, pride kept me from going home. I headed to the city park where the homeless gathered. That night, around 11 p.m., I noticed other homeless people huddled under blankets, sleeping on benches. I felt out of place but didn't want to admit it. Late at night, an older man named Rick approached me. He looked like someone who knew what it meant to be on the streets. "You're not homeless, kid," he said. "You have family. Go back to them before it's too late." I didn't take his advice and stayed for 3 more nights. Each time I settled on a bench, Rick would come up and say, "Go home. This isn't your place." But my pride wouldn't let me turn back. On the 4th night, I finally decided I needed something to eat. I approached one of the groups of homeless people, hoping to make friends and maybe get some food. But when I asked one of them, he rudely told me to go away. I noticed a candy bar sticking out of his pocket. I was hungry, and in that moment, I didn't care about morality. I snatched the candy bar and ran off to hide, then returned to the others, trying to blend in. A few hours later, I saw that the man had started checking his pockets. I tried to remain inconspicuous, but soon realized he had noticed the missing candy. His face twisted with rage as he started drinking from his beer bottle faster, as if gearing up to unleash his anger. Suddenly, he exploded, smashing the bottle over another homeless man's head, causing him to fall, crying out in pain. I felt my heart drop. I knew this was all because of my actions. I couldn't believe that my behavior had led to such violence. Inside, guilt and fear battled for control, but paralyzed by fear for my own safety, I didn't say a word. Amidst all the chaos, Rick approached me and quietly said, "Get out of here. This isn't your fight. You have a chance to leave." I hurriedly left the park and walked several blocks until I found myself at my house. At that moment, I realized I was tired of hiding behind my pride. I knocked on the door, and when my mom opened it, I rushed in to apologize. I confessed everything: my selfishness, my foolishness, and my fears. It was a hard conversation, but it became a turning point in my life. Now, looking back, I feel deep shame for my actions and for potentially bringing harm to someone else due to my greed. But this experience changed me. I learned to value my family and realized that the consequences of even the smallest actions can be devastating. If I hadn't faced that situation, who knows where I might still be wandering the streets. But now I'm on the path to becoming a better person. Story number 5. In a small town on the edge of a forest stood an abandoned house. The locals avoided it, sharing terrifying legends about how people had disappeared within its walls. They said that a woman's spirit lived there, unable to find peace after a tragic death. One day, a group of teenagers, fueled by the rumors, decided to spend the night in this ominous place. They brought flashlights, cameras, and plenty of snacks, confident they could dispel their fears. As soon as they entered the house, a cold air enveloped them, and the floorboards creaked underfoot, as if warning them of danger. On the first floor, they found old furniture covered in dust and photographs that once belonged to the family who lived there. One photo in particular caught their attention. It depicted a woman with sorrowful eyes. The teens began to joke and take silly pictures, but with each passing moment, the atmosphere grew increasingly unsettling. On the second floor, they decided to explore the bedrooms. In one of them, they discovered an old music box. One of the boys, wanting to show off his bravery, opened it. A haunting and melancholic melody filled the air, and in that moment they all felt something cold and invisible wrap around them. Soon the laughter and jokes faded when they heard a faint whisper. "Leave now," someone said, sending chills down their spines. The teens exchanged glances, but no one dared to voice that they had all heard it. They decided it was just the wind, but fear mounted. When one of them went to check what was happening on the stairs, he saw a shadow moving slowly down the hallway. In a panic, he screamed, and they all rushed for the exit, but the door was locked. Terror overtook them as they pushed and pulled at the doorknob, but nothing happened. At that moment, the melody from the music box played again, and they saw the figure of a woman emerge from the darkness, her face twisted in sorrow and anger. "Why have you come here?" she asked, her voice cold as ice. The teens, bewildered, tried to explain that they just wanted to have fun, but the woman shook her head. "You have disturbed my peace. Now you must pay the price." Suddenly, as if by magic, the house began to tremble. The walls closed in, and shadows enveloped them. Each of them felt fear seeping into their hearts. In an instant, they found themselves in a dark room, alone with the woman's figure. With horror, they realized they couldn't escape. The night stretched on endlessly, and each began to see their deepest fears and regrets. Once they had been friends, but now each was isolated in their own personal hell. The next day, townsfolk found the empty house. No one had seen the teenagers, but fingerprints remained on the windows, as if someone had desperately tried to escape. The legend of the abandoned house only grew stronger, and no one dared to approach the place where the woman's soul sought vengeance and peace. Story number 6. In an abandoned building on the outskirts of the city, a group of homeless people gathered. Snow had buried the streets, and the cold pierced to the bone. Inside it was dark and damp, but it offered some protection from the biting wind. Among them was Jason, a man who had lost hope and had once worked as a mechanic. One day he found an old radio broadcast in a trash can that spoke of a mysterious abandoned house on the edge of the woods. They said something terrible lurked there, but food and warmth could be found if one dared to take the risk. One day, when the frost became unbearable, the group decided to head to that house. They were met with an ominous silence. As they entered, the first thing that caught their eye was the peeling wallpaper covered in mold and shadows that seemed to move on their own. Suddenly, one of them, an old man named Greg, screamed. He pointed at a window where whispers could be heard. These were voices calling them to come outside. Fear gripped the group, but the bitter cold outside kept them inside. They couldn't agree to risk going back out. In the dark, someone noticed that the doors began to close on their own. The group realized they were trapped inside. Panic seized them. Gradually, one by one, they began to disappear. First, Greg vanished, his scream frozen on his lips as he tried to escape. Then 2 others were gone, and soon only Jason and a young woman named Emily remained. They decided to find a way out, but every time they approached the door, darkness engulfed them, forcing them back into the room. Suddenly, Emily pointed at an old, cracked mirror cabinet. In its reflection, they saw not themselves but distorted, sinister faces. These were the faces of those who had vanished. Jason, realizing that this was no ordinary abandoned house but a trap, decided to break free by shattering the mirror. He struck the glass with all his might. A dull thud echoed, and the mirror shattered. From its shards, shadowy entities emerged, beginning to pull them deeper inside. With cold terror, Jason grabbed Emily's hand. They ran, but the doors would no longer open. At the last moment, he turned around and saw the shards reassembling into a mirrored surface. Emily disappeared in the blink of an eye, and with her vanished the last ray of hope. Now, days later, he sits once more in the abandoned building, his body trembling from the cold, and his eyes filled with emptiness. Every evening, those who had vanished come to him, whispering about what it's like to be trapped in this snare. He knows he cannot escape, and with each passing moment he becomes more a part of this place, gradually transforming into one of those shadows that lure new homeless souls into their web. Story number 7. I woke up to the cold seeping through the thin blankets left for me by kind strangers. Around me was darkness, punctuated only by the sporadic flickers of streetlights that pulled familiar silhouettes from the shadows. I had found myself in an old cemetery where neglected graves were overgrown with moss, as if time had stood still. I had come here a few days ago, fleeing from my thoughts and those who once betrayed me. On the streets of Auckland, I sought refuge from the rain, but life as a homeless person is a constant struggle, and I couldn't stay in a place where people were too caught up in their own lives to notice me. That night, I decided to stay here in the cemetery. It seemed that the silence could become my only friend, but as the first hours of night passed, I realized I wasn't alone. At first, it was just a rustle. I thought it was the wind, but then footsteps sounded drawing nearer. I held my breath, straining to listen as the sounds grew clearer. My nerves were on edge when I spotted shadowy figures moving between the graves. Their shapes appeared strange, as if they were not quite of this world. I couldn't believe my eyes when one of the figures approached closer. It was a girl, her hair covered in dirt, with eyes that glimmered like stars. She smiled, but there was no joy in that smile, only endless sorrow. "Are you alone too?" she asked. Her voice sounded like a whisper of the wind. I couldn't respond, I could only nod. In that moment I realized she wasn't just a ghost. She was a soul lost, just like me, trapped in this world between life and death. "This place isn't for us," she said, glancing at the graves. "But they won't let us go. They are waiting." I felt the cold creep into my bones. Was it possible that I would never leave this place? I tried to stand, but my legs felt as though they were glued to the ground. "You need to go," she whispered, her voice urgent, "or you'll stay here forever." Finally, I gathered my strength and ran into the darkness, not daring to look back. The footsteps behind me grew louder, but I sprinted until I burst onto the city streets. Yet even now, as I was far from the cemetery, I felt something unseen pulling me back. Since then, I've tried to stay away from dark corners and abandoned places. But sometimes when night envelops the city, I hear whispers, and I feel like she's calling me. I know that if I turn around, I will see that same sorrowful smile, and then I won't be able to leave it all. Story number 8. In a small town surrounded by dense forests, everyone knew about the legend passed down through generations. It was said that something sinister dwelled in those woods, a shadow that took those brave enough to get lost. No one knew where this shadow came from, but the old folks on the benches outside the stores always warned, "Don't go into the woods at dusk." Despite the warnings, a young woman named Emily decided to spend her weekend in nature. Full of energy and a desire to explore, she set off alone when her friends declined to join her. With a tent, backpack, and determination, she ventured into the woods. As the sun set, darkness enveloped the forest. Emily pitched her tent and started a fire that crackled brightly, creating a cozy atmosphere. She felt great until she heard strange noises from the trees, a rustle, as if something was moving. Trying to calm herself, she dismissed it as just the wind. Soon, Emily decided to go to sleep, but a nagging feeling lingered. In the middle of the night, she awoke with the unsettling sensation that someone was watching her. In the dim light of the tent, she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Cautiously, she peered out of the tent and froze in fear. At the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the shadows, stood a dark figure. She couldn't make out any details, but she knew it wasn't human. Panic surged through her. She quickly crawled back into the tent, pulling the sleeping bag over her head and holding her breath. But soon the figure vanished. After a while, when her fear began to subside, Emily convinced herself it was just her imagination and tried to drift back to sleep. In the morning, she woke up with an unsettling feeling. The fire had gone out, and there was an eerie silence around the tent. Suddenly, she noticed that all her belongings were scattered on the ground, as if someone had been searching for something. Her heart raced. It was time to leave. She packed her things and headed towards the exit of the woods. As she walked down the familiar trail, she heard footsteps behind her. Heavy steps, as if something large was following her. She turned around but saw nothing. The forest felt even more foreboding, and Emily began to run. Every rustle, every breath made her pulse quicken. Then she saw a face high up in the trees, resembling a human but twisted and shrouded in dark shadows. The figure reappeared, now much closer, and Emily realized it was not just a shadow, it was something else, something unexplainable. She bolted off the trail, desperate to escape. The sound of footsteps followed her, growing ever closer. Emily could feel something cold breathing down her neck. In a panic, she stumbled onto a clearing where sunlight still pierced through the leaves. Finally, she burst into the open, but there awaited another shadow, and she understood that this forest was alive, and it wasn't going to let her go. The shadow turned and, with a silent scream, lunged at her, consuming everything around. When they found her the next day, Emily lay unconscious, her eyes filled with terror. The forest fell silent once more, as if nothing had happened. Only the echo of her scream seemed to linger between the trees, reminding others of the sinister presence that lurked in the woods. Story number 9. Veronica was born into a life of privilege in the affluent city of Silverstone. Her family owned a chain of luxury hotels, and she was used to having everything handed to her on a silver platter. With her designer clothes, extravagant parties, and private schools, Veronica lived in a world of opulence where money seemed endless. However, her life took a dark turn when her father was implicated in a massive financial scandal. The once respected hotelier was arrested, and their family fortune crumbled overnight. The luxurious lifestyle that Veronica had taken for granted vanished, and she suddenly found herself without a home, cut off from her friends, and left to fend for herself. Desperate and scared, Veronica wandered the streets of Silverstone, a city she had once ruled. She tried to seek help from the people she once considered friends, but they turned their backs on her, unwilling to associate with someone who had fallen so far. Stripped of her wealth and status, she quickly realized how harsh the world could be. With nowhere to go, Veronica found herself in a run-down shelter. The nights were cold and unforgiving, and she felt the weight of her loss pressing down on her. As days turned into weeks, she started to adapt to her new reality, but the shadows of her former life haunted her. One night, while trying to sleep on a cold bench in the park, she was awakened by a group of men laughing and joking nearby. They were drunk, and their raucous voices cut through the silence like a knife. Veronica pulled her coat tighter around her, hoping they wouldn't notice her. But they did. The men approached her, leering and taunting. "Look what we have here. A little rich girl playing at being poor." One of them sneered. They surrounded her, and panic surged through Veronica. She remembered her former life, the safety, the security, and felt an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. In that moment, she realized how quickly everything could be taken away. The laughter of the men turned sinister as they pushed her to the ground, their faces distorted in the dim light. Just when she thought things couldn't get worse, one of them pulled out a knife. "Let's see how tough you are without your daddy's money," he said, advancing toward her. Veronica closed her eyes, bracing for the worst. But in a surge of adrenaline, she managed to push herself up and run. She fled through the dark streets, heart pounding in her chest. The echo of their laughter followed her, taunting her. She ran until her legs felt like lead, finally collapsing in an alleyway, gasping for breath. In that moment, Veronica understood the true meaning of fear. As she sat in the darkness, surrounded by garbage and the stench of despair, she felt the world closing in. She was no longer Veronica the rich girl. She was just another face in the shadows, a nameless figure lost in a city that had once been her playground. Days turned into a blur as she tried to survive. She scavenged for food, slept in alleys, and avoided the dangers lurking in the night. The once glamorous girl transformed into a ghost of her former self, her spirit slowly eroding with each passing day. One night, while rummaging through a dumpster behind a restaurant, she found a small, tattered photo of herself from years ago, smiling in a beautiful dress at one of her father's lavish parties. Tears streamed down her face as she realized how far she had fallen. The weight of regret and loss pressed heavily on her heart. In that moment, Veronica made a choice. She couldn't change her past, but she could fight for her future. With newfound determination, she sought out local shelters, started attending support groups, and slowly began to rebuild her life. Though it was a long and difficult journey, she vowed never to forget the lessons learned in the depths of despair. Veronica transformed her pain into purpose, using her experiences to help others who had fallen through the cracks. In the end, she emerged stronger, but she would never forget the darkness that had once consumed her. The world was cruel, but it was also filled with the possibility of redemption, and Veronica was ready to face it, one step at a time. Story number 10. In a small town in northern England lived a man named Tom. In his youth, he worked in construction, had a family, and a small house. But one day, life took a sharp turn. His wife left him, leaving behind debts, and soon he lost his job. At first, he tried to cope on his own, but failures piled up like snow on a roof. Tom ended up on the street, and his days turned into an endless struggle for survival. He slept in parks and under bridges, scavenging for food in trash cans. Despite the harsh conditions, he remained a kind and responsive person. He often shared his found food with other homeless individuals, trying to create a sense of community. One chilly autumn morning, while Tom sat on a bench in the park with a cup of hot tea, a young woman named Lisa approached him. She was a volunteer for a charitable organization and was bringing hot meals for the homeless. Lisa was struck by Tom's kindness and his ability to maintain optimism in such difficult circumstances. They struck up a conversation, and soon a friendship blossomed between them. Lisa began visiting Tom regularly, bringing him food, clothing, and most importantly, hope. She talked about her plans to create a social project to help the homeless, and Tom became part of that idea. Together, they organized meetings for the homeless where they could share their stories and find support in each other. With each passing day, Tom became more involved in this work. He began to talk about his experiences, how he had lost everything he loved, but also about the importance of not losing hope. His heartfelt words touched many, and soon their meetings began attracting not only the homeless but also those who wanted to help. Months passed, and thanks to the efforts of Lisa and Tom, the project began to flourish. Volunteers from the city started to come, and fundraising and donation drives for the homeless were organized. Tom even became a leader of the support group, teaching others how to cope with hardships and find strength within themselves. But one day, during an event, Tom encountered someone from his past, his former employer, who didn't recognize him. This became a turning point for Tom. He realized he could no longer remain in the role of a victim. With Lisa's support, he began looking for work. After several months of searching, he finally found a position in a small construction company. Working there, Tom once again felt needed and valued. His life gradually started to improve. He was able to rent a room and even helped other homeless people find jobs through his organization. Tom's story became known in the town, and he often spoke at meetings sharing his experiences. His example inspired many, showing that even in the darkest times, there is always a chance to change one's life. Over time, Tom rebuilt his relationship with his daughter, with whom he hadn't spoken for a long time. He understood that his path hadn't been easy, but every step toward the light was significant. Thanks to Lisa and others who believed in him, he became a symbol of hope and change for many. Tom continued to help other homeless individuals, believing that everyone deserves a second chance. His life was filled with meaning, and he became the person he had once sought within himself. Story number 11. It was an ordinary autumn when I first met Larry at the shelter. His tattoos, especially the 1488, immediately set me on edge. He was the type of person who invited himself into your life, and when he found out I was leaving, he left me no choice. "I'm going with you," he said with a confident smile. I didn't know how to handle him. I had my own reasons for leaving town, and they didn't include the company of someone who talked nonstop for 8 hours straight. Along the way, he repeatedly asked me about the money my mom had given me, but I dodged the question. When we finally crossed the last pass and neared the city, Larry got a call from his boss. His plans had changed, and now he needed to be 2 hours away. I could see the anger wash over his face. He started to lay a guilt trip on me, and while I tried to stay calm, I was already feeling a rebellion building inside. At the bus station, he looked lost. He needed $158 for a ticket, but I only had $70 left, and I wasn't about to share. He suggested he stay at the homeless shelter, but he insisted on crashing on my mom's couch. I realized that wasn't an option. When we arrived at Flying J, he began to slowly pull out his things, as if trying to make me feel guilty, but I knew I had to stop it. I turned around and drove away, leaving him behind, feeling an internal relief. A couple of days later, I got a call from him, but I didn't answer. My gut feeling was right, and I decided I didn't want to deal with him again. During this time, I met Tim. He was similar to Larry, but without the tattoos. We discussed plans for a trip to another state for the harvest season, where he promised to pay for gas and return me with a bunch of weed. It sounded too good to be true, but I was willing to take the risk. Unfortunately, Jack, who was the main financier of our plan, backed out. Tim still wanted to go, and even though he had no money, He assured me he would figure something out. At that moment, I started to have doubts. All my previous attempts to help people had ended in failure. I found myself in another situation where someone was expecting too much from me. In the end, I decided not to take the risk. I thanked him for his offer but said I couldn't do it right now. I realized that every time I tried to help, it was just a continuation of an endless chain of expectations and disappointments. Traveling with strangers can be exciting, but sometimes it's better to choose your own path. When I returned home, I felt I had made the right decision this time. Story number 12. It was a hot summer in the city. The asphalt melted under the blazing sun, and the air was thick with humidity, making it hard to escape. On the streets wandered a homeless man named Jake. He was around 40 and life had thrown many heavy trials his way. But he hadn't always been on the streets once he had a family, a job, and a home. But as the years went by, difficulties piled up like a snowball, and eventually Jake found himself alone. Every morning, he woke up on a bench in the park, where the shade of the trees offered some respite from the heat. He carried a worn-out bag containing his most valuable possessions, a few shirts, a pair of pants, and a neglected notebook in which he sometimes recorded his thoughts. Jake loved to write. It was the only thing that helped him cope with loneliness. That day, he decided to head to the local market. Among the bustling stalls, he hoped to find some food. Jake knew that no one was waiting for him, but he always dreamed that someone would notice him and ask how he was doing. On his way, he met a young woman named Amy. She was selling lemonade on the corner of the street. When their eyes met, Jake felt that she looked at him not with pity, but with interest. "Would you like some lemonade?" she asked, pointing to a glass barrel of cold drink. Jake shook his head. He had no money, but Amy seemed to understand. She stepped closer and poured him a cup. "Here, just take it. You need to stay hydrated in this heat," she said with a smile. This simple act of kindness touched Jake. He thanked her, and they chatted for a while. She told him about her dream of opening her own cafe, and he shared his story how he lost everything and ended up on the street. They talked until the sun began to set, and Jake felt a sense of ease and comfort with Amy. The next day, Jake returned to see Amy again. They talked once more, and each time he visited, he felt more alive. He began to tell her about the notes in his notebook and how he longed to write about life on the streets, about the people who, like him, struggled to survive. Amy suggested he read some of his writings. At first, Jake hesitated, but eventually agreed. He read a few pages about his experiences, about how difficult it was to remain invisible, and how important it was to feel supported. Inspired by his words, Amy proposed organizing a small gathering in the park where he could read his stories to others. Jake was taken aback. "Why would anyone want to listen to me?" he asked. "Because your stories are important," Amy replied. "They can help others understand that life can be tough, but there is also beauty in it." A few weeks later, they indeed held a gathering. At first, only a few people showed up, but with each meeting, more and more wanted to listen. Jake began to feel that his voice was being heard, and his stories mattered. He realized that despite his struggles, he was not alone. As summer drew to a close, it was a time of change for Jake. He found not only friends, but also new hopes. Amy helped him compile his writings and even suggested submitting them to a local publisher. Jake realized that he could change his life if he continued to share his experiences. So when it came time to say goodbye to summer, Jake was no longer the same person who had arrived in the city. He understood that even in the darkest corners of life, there is always room for light and hope, and that true strength lies in opening oneself up to others. I woke up in an abandoned building where an old man once lived. The sun had already set, and a cold wind seeped through the cracks in the walls. He pulled all my clothes tightly around me, trying to keep even a shred of warmth. Inside, the building was empty and dark, and occasionally faint rays of dim light pierced through the windows. Every night I wandered the streets searching for food, but something felt different today. I sensed that someone was watching me. The echo of footsteps in the silence felt like someone was sneaking up behind me, hiding in the shadows. I quickened my pace, but it didn't help. My instincts told me I wasn't alone. When I returned to the building, I heard a rustle. My heart raced, and I squinted into the darkness. "It's just the wind," I told myself, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was observing me. Suddenly, something moved in the corner of the room. I knew it could just be a rat, but still, I clenched my fists, ready for a fight. I slowly approached the corner, but when I looked there, nothing was there. just an old newspaper and a broken bottle. I turned to return to my spot when I saw him. He was standing by the door, tall and thin, with a face covered in dirt. His eyes glimmered in the darkness like two black holes, and his presence sent chills down my spine. "You shouldn't be here," he spoke softly, his voice carved from stone. I couldn't speak. Inside me, a sense of dread grew. He stepped closer, and I hastily retreated. "I just want to leave," I stammered, even though I knew there was no way out. He only smiled, and I noticed his teeth gleaming in the dark. As if reading my thoughts, he said, "You don't understand. Everything here is already lost. This place, it takes people." I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't obey, as if they were glued to the floor. At that moment, I felt something cold touch my back. I turned and saw that the darkness around me was thickening, taking the shape of people. Their faces were twisted in fear and despair, their hands reaching out to me as if trying to help, but their lips were silent. I screamed and dashed for the exit, but as soon as I reached the door, it slammed shut with a loud crack. I was trapped. These ghosts stood around me, and the man with the dirty face looked at me with satisfaction. "Welcome home," he said, and in that moment, I realized that this was my new reality. I hadn't just gotten lost, I had become part of this place, this cursed building where shadows live their own lives, and the souls of the lost are eternal in the darkness. On that rainy evening, after a long shift at the late-night diner, I was driving home along my usual route. The landscape, beautiful by day, transformed into a series of dark shadows at night, with only the occasional flickering lights of small shops and restaurants. I felt oddly energetic, despite my fatigue, and knew I'd have to take melatonin when I got home. As I passed a small parking lot near a well-known deli, I saw a woman standing under a streetlight. She was tall, about 6 feet, and despite the rain, her smile shone as if she were oblivious to the downpour. I slowed down and rolled down my window. "Do you need help?" I called out, trying to shake off my awkwardness. She stepped closer, her eyes sparkling with gratitude. "Oh, you're a real hero," she exclaimed as she opened the door and got into my car. "I'm just heading into town, not far from here." I asked where she lived, and when she answered, I felt a slight unease. Her voice was warm, but there was an underlying tension in her tone. I noticed she was missing a few teeth, but she looked tidy, even though she was drenched. "Do you need anything from the store?" I asked as we approached a gas station. "No, thank you," she replied with a smile. "I'm just happy you stopped." I got out of the car and headed into the store, trying to push away the strange feeling. After grabbing some snacks and drinks, I returned to the car. She looked at me with such genuine appreciation that I felt a bit better. "You're a kind person," she said as she accepted the treats from me. "Just trying to do something good," I replied, feeling a bit awkward. As we drove, the conversation became lighter. She shared memories of the town, how everything had changed over the years. Her stories were vivid and full of emotion, and I gradually began to relax. "I always say we need to look out for each other," she remarked as we passed dark stretches of road. "In our times, that's especially important." We stopped on the side of the road, and I felt a sense of unease building inside me. "This is good," she said, pointing to a small park. "You can drop me off here." I nodded uncertainly, glancing around. "Are you sure?" I asked. "It's dark." "Yes, it's perfect," she insisted with a smile. "Thank you for everything. You truly made my evening better." She stepped out of the car, and I suddenly felt a chill in the air. I watched her walk away into the rain, her silhouette fading into the night. Something inside me urged me to ask her more, to learn how she ended up alone on such a night, but instead I just nodded, feeling a sense of unease growing in my chest. As I drove away, the rain poured harder, and I tried to calm my thoughts. My intuition whispered that this encounter was something more than just random kindness. When I got home, I took the melatonin and lay down, but sleep wouldn't come. Thoughts of the woman and who she was spun around in my mind. Watching the flickering lights outside my window, I realized one thing: sometimes the most ordinary actions can lead to the most extraordinary consequences. Hey friends, if you enjoy our content, please subscribe to our channel. It really helps us grow. Just hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss anything. Thanks for your support.